The day someone reaches for your hand can become the day you finally stop letting go of yourself. If you had asked me at 52 whether life could begin again, I would have smiled politely and changed the subject because hope felt like something designed for younger women with untouched dreams, not for someone carrying nearly 3 decades of quiet compromises inside her heart. 3 weeks before I arrived at the retreat, a judge had ended my 29-year marriage with 2 signatures and a few carefully rehearsed sentences that sounded strangely ordinary for something that had once defined my entire life. I walked out of the courthouse holding a small envelope filled with legal papers, wondering why freedom could feel so much like grief. Friends called it a fresh start. My daughter called it a chance to rediscover myself. I nodded every time someone offered encouragement, because it seemed easier than admitting I had no idea who Claire Donovan was without the routines that had shaped nearly half my life. Every morning I still reached for the second coffee mug before remembering there was no reason to pour another cup. Every evening I still listened for footsteps that never came. The silence inside my little Portland home slowly became louder than any conversation I had ever known. My family doctor finally suggested a weekend wellness retreat in the Cascade Mountains, a place where women recovering from major life changes gathered to rest, reflect, and begin again. I almost threw the brochure away. Yoga classes, nature walks, watercolor painting, journaling circles. None of it sounded capable of repairing the invisible cracks running through my heart. Still, spending another weekend alone felt even heavier, so I packed a small suitcase, folded my favorite blue sweater into the top compartment, and drove east beneath a gray winter sky. The retreat rested beside a frozen lake surrounded by towering evergreen trees dusted with fresh snow. Smoke curled gently from stone chimneys, and the scent of cedar drifted through the crisp mountain air. Women around my age greeted one another with hesitant smiles that quietly revealed they were carrying stories much like mine. I checked into the lodge, accepted a handwritten welcome packet, and slipped into the back row of the opening gathering, hoping to remain unnoticed until I could quietly leave. The facilitator invited everyone to introduce themselves one by one. My heart tightened. I was not ready to summarize 29 complicated years into a few comfortable sentences for complete strangers. Before my turn arrived, I quietly stood, picked up my coat and headed toward the door. I had almost reached it when warm fingers gently wrapped around my hand. The touch lasted only a moment, but it stopped every frightened thought racing through my mind. I turned and found a woman with kind hazel eyes, soft silver strands woven through dark brown hair, and the calm expression of someone who understood broken hearts without asking for explanations. She did not question why I wanted to leave. She simply smiled and said, "You do not have to tell anyone your story today. You only have to give yourself one more chance to live it." Something deep inside me shifted so quietly that nobody else in the room could possibly have noticed. I looked down at her hand resting lightly over mine, then back into her gentle eyes. Without understanding why, I slowly released my coat, turned away from the exit, and chose the empty chair beside her instead. The first morning at the retreat arrived quietly, wrapped in pale sunlight spilling across the frozen lake outside our cabin. I woke before the alarm, confused for a moment by the unfamiliar ceiling made of rough cedar beams instead of the white plaster I had stared at every morning for almost 30 years. Then I remembered where I was and why I had come. The silence felt different here. It was not the lonely silence waiting inside my empty house back in Portland. This silence carried birdsong, distant wind moving through pine trees, and the faint crackling sound of a fireplace somewhere nearby. When I stepped into the small living area, I found the woman from the welcome gathering standing beside the tiny kitchen counter, pouring hot water into 2 mugs. She looked over her shoulder and smiled with the same calm warmth that had stopped me from walking away the evening before. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you like cinnamon tea." I accepted the mug, surprised that she had already made one for me. "Thank you," I answered. "I am Claire." She laughed softly. "I know. I finally heard your name after you decided not to escape." I could not help smiling back. That obvious? Only to someone who has stood near that same door. We carried our mugs onto the small porch where fresh snow covered the wooden railing in a thin white blanket. The mountains reflected across the frozen lake, glowing beneath the rising sun. We stood there quietly for several minutes before she finally introduced herself. "I am Naomi Brooks." Her voice carried the easy confidence of someone who no longer needed to impress anyone. It felt comforting instead of intimidating. After breakfast, the retreat coordinator gathered everyone inside the main lodge. She apologized for an unexpected problem. Overnight, a heating system had failed in several cabins, leaving only half the accommodations usable until maintenance crews could finish repairs later that day. New room assignments were quickly announced while women exchanged amused glances and shuffled their luggage across the room. When my name was called, I looked up just in time to hear the coordinator continue. Claire Donovan will temporarily share Cedar Cabin with Naomi Brooks. Naomi raised one eyebrow before laughing quietly. Apparently the mountains have made our schedule for us. Cedar Cabin sat near the edge of the forest, overlooking the lake through enormous windows. Relief washed over me when I opened the bedroom door and saw two comfortable twin beds separated by a small wooden table with a reading lamp. Naomi noticed the expression on my face and smiled kindly. "Do not worry. I snore only when I have a cold." I laughed harder than I expected, and the sound startled me. It had been months since laughter had escaped so naturally. We unpacked in comfortable silence. Naomi placed watercolor brushes, sketchbooks, and a stack of novels beside her bed, while I folded sweaters into the dresser with careful precision, still clinging to habits built over decades. Later that afternoon, we joined a gentle walk around the lake with the rest of the group. Snow crunched beneath our boots while the scent of cedar filled the crisp air. Naomi never walked ahead of me or behind me. She simply matched my pace without making it obvious. At one point she glanced toward the mountains and quietly asked, "Before life became busy taking care of everyone else, what did Claire dream about?" The question stopped me more completely than the icy wind. I searched for an answer, but only silence came. Finally I looked down at the untouched snow beneath my boots and admitted, "I honestly do not remember." Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She simply smiled with gentle understanding and said, "Then maybe that is exactly where we begin." The next morning began with the scent of fresh pine drifting through the open windows of the art studio overlooking the lake. Overnight, the snowfall had stopped, leaving the mountains wrapped in brilliant sunlight that reflected across the frozen water like scattered pieces of glass. Naomi greeted everyone with paintbrushes tucked into the pocket of her soft gray cardigan, instead of a clipboard or a schedule. "Today," she said with an easy smile, "there are no mistakes, only discoveries." I chose a seat near the window, hoping the landscape might distract me from the blank sheet of watercolor paper waiting in front of me. I had spent most of my life organizing books, balancing budgets, remembering birthdays, and solving other people's problems. Nobody had asked me to create something simply because it brought me joy. Naomi walked slowly around the room, encouraging every woman to forget perfection. "Paint a memory," she suggested, "or paint a feeling. The paper does not care whether anyone else understands it." I dipped my brush into pale blue, then soft gold, then a quiet shade of green that reminded me of the evergreen trees surrounding the retreat. The colors spread gently across the page without becoming anything recognizable, yet I could not stop smiling as they blended together. Naomi paused beside my easel but waited until I looked up before speaking. "May I say something?" she asked. I nodded. She studied the painting for a thoughtful moment before saying, "You are not painting the lake. You are painting space. That tells me your heart is finally making room for something new." I laughed softly. "You can tell all that from a few colors? Sometimes colors speak before people are ready to." Her words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. After lunch, the group followed a winding trail around the lake. Snow crunched beneath our boots while tiny streams of melting ice sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Naomi walked beside me without filling every silence. Somehow she understood that companionship did not always require conversation. We stopped on a weathered wooden bridge crossing a narrow creek where clear water slipped beneath thin sheets of ice. "Can I ask you another difficult question?" she said. I smiled. "You seem to enjoy those." She laughed quietly. "Only because your honest answers are always worth waiting for." She rested her hands on the wooden railing and looked toward the mountains. "If nobody expected anything from you ever again, how would you spend your mornings?" I opened my mouth with another practical answer already forming, then stopped. I pictured shelves of novels, a sketchbook resting beside a steaming cup of tea, long walks through quiet forests, afternoons spent writing thoughts I had never shared with anyone. The images arrived so naturally that they surprised me. I whispered. I would finally spend time becoming someone I actually know. Naomi turned toward me with gentle pride instead of surprise. I was hoping you would say something like that. On the walk back, a patch of hidden ice shifted beneath my boot. I slipped only slightly before instinctively reaching for balance. Naomi caught my hand without hesitation. Our fingers remained together for one quiet heartbeat longer than necessary. Neither of us pulled away immediately. The world around us seemed to pause beneath the bright winter sky, and for the first time in my life, the simple comfort of another woman's hand resting in mine awakened a feeling I had never found words to describe. It was not sudden certainty. It was something softer, quieter, and somehow even more powerful. It felt like the first page of a story I had never imagined I would have the courage to live. That evening the retreat gathered inside the main lodge for what the schedule simply called reflection night. Candles flickered along the stone fireplace, gentle piano music drifted through the room, and the scent of cedar mixed with freshly baked bread until the entire space felt warm enough to soften even the oldest sorrow. We sat together in a wide circle while the facilitator placed a small wooden bowl in the center and invited anyone who wished to finish one simple sentence. Today I remembered. One woman remembered how much she loved gardening. Another remembered that laughter could return after grief. When the bowl reached me, I stared at it for several quiet seconds before speaking. Today I remembered that I still have dreams I have never lived. The room remained silent for a heartbeat before several women smiled with quiet understanding. Across the circle, Naomi met my eyes but said nothing. She only smiled with the gentle pride of someone watching another person find her own voice again. Later that night I stepped outside to breathe the cool mountain air. Snowflakes drifted lazily beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars, and the frozen lake reflected the moon so perfectly that the horizon seemed to disappear. I wrapped my coat a little tighter around myself as I walked toward the wooden dock. A few moments later I heard footsteps behind me. Naomi stopped beside me without interrupting the silence. "You seem lighter tonight," she said softly. I looked across the shimmering ice before answering. "Maybe because I finally stopped pretending I know exactly who I am supposed to become." She nodded. The best parts of life rarely begin with certainty. We stood together watching the wind move across the lake. There was no need to fill every quiet moment with conversation. Somehow the silence itself had become part of our friendship. My phone suddenly vibrated inside my coat pocket, breaking the stillness. I looked down and saw a name I had hoped would remain in the past. My former husband. The screen displayed 3 missed calls followed by a text message. "Please answer. I have made the biggest mistake of my life. I need to see you." My chest tightened in a way that surprised me. Only a few weeks earlier those words would have been enough to send me running back toward a life built on familiarity instead of happiness. Now they only left me confused. Naomi noticed the change in my expression but never tried to look at my phone. "Everything all right?" she asked quietly. I hesitated before showing her the message. She read only enough to understand who had written it before looking away again. "You do not owe anyone an immediate answer," she said. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is give our hearts enough time to speak before our fears do." I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. The wind carried the scent of pine through the trees as we slowly walked toward Cedar Cabin together. Just as we reached the porch, bright headlights swept across the snow-covered driveway leading into the retreat. A dark sedan rolled to a stop near the entrance. The driver's door opened, and the last person I ever expected to see standing there stepped into the falling snow while searching the retreat grounds until his eyes found mine. For a long moment neither of us moved. Snow settled quietly on the shoulders of my former husband as he stood beneath the porch light, looking older than I remembered and somehow smaller than the man who had once filled every corner of my life. He offered a hesitant smile before speaking my name. "Claire." Hearing his voice again stirred memories I had spent weeks trying to untangle, but it did not pull me backward the way I expected. Naomi glanced toward me, then gently stepped away. "I will be inside," she said softly. "Take all the time you need." There was no jealousy in her voice. No pressure. Only trust. I watched her disappear into the warm glow of Cedar Cabin before turning back toward the man I had once promised forever. "How did you find me?" I asked. He lowered his eyes. "Emily told me where you were." She was worried about you. I sighed quietly. Our daughter had always wanted peace more than she wanted either of us to be right. You should not have come. He nodded as though he had already expected that answer. Probably not. But I could not live with myself if I never tried. We walked slowly toward the edge of the frozen lake where the retreat lights faded into soft shadows. For the first time in years, he spoke without defending himself. He admitted how often he had chosen work over our marriage. He admitted how easily he had mistaken my loyalty for endless patience. He admitted that he had noticed my loneliness long before the divorce but convinced himself there would always be another chance to fix things later. There was always another meeting, he whispered. Another deadline. Another excuse. I listened without interrupting because I finally understood that forgiveness begins with listening, not agreement. When he finished, the silence between us felt gentler than the years we had spent avoiding difficult truths. I am sorry, he said. If there is even the smallest possibility that we could begin again, I would spend the rest of my life earning it. I looked across the frozen lake where moonlight shimmered over the ice. Only days earlier those words would have sounded like everything I had wanted to hear. Now they felt strangely distant, like reading a chapter from a book I had already finished. I thought about cinnamon tea on a quiet porch, watercolor spreading across blank paper, long walks through evergreen forests, and a woman who had never once asked me to become anyone except myself. I realized the greatest difference between the two relationships was not romance. It was freedom. I believe you are sorry, I said gently, and I truly hope you become the man you are describing. But I cannot return to the woman I had to be in order to stay married. Tears filled his eyes, yet he slowly nodded. Then this goodbye is real. Yes, I answered. But it does not have to be cruel. He stepped forward and gave me a brief, respectful hug before walking back toward his car without asking me to change my mind. I watched the headlights disappear through the snow until only the quiet mountain night remained. When I returned to Cedar Cabin, the lights suddenly flickered before the electricity failed across the retreat. Only the fireplace continued glowing inside the living room. Naomi sat on the rug with 2 blankets folded beside her. She looked up as I entered but did not ask what had happened. I crossed the room and sat beside her. The fire painted warm light across the wooden walls while snow drifted softly beyond the windows. After several peaceful minutes, Naomi slowly reached toward my hand, stopping just short of touching it as though waiting for permission. This time I closed the distance myself, gently intertwining my fingers with hers, and in that quiet moment I understood that choosing the future sometimes begins with the smallest act of courage. Morning arrived with the quiet crackle of burning cedar, and pale sunlight slipping through the cabin windows. I woke still feeling the warmth of Naomi's hand resting in my memory, more clearly than the blanket wrapped around my shoulders. For a few peaceful seconds I allowed myself to believe the hardest part of my journey had ended. Then reality reminded me that healing rarely moved in a straight line. After breakfast, the retreat coordinator announced that the heating system had finally been repaired. Everyone could return to private cabins before the closing weekend activities began. Women around the room smiled as they gathered their luggage, but an unexpected disappointment settled quietly inside me. Sharing Cedar Cabin had never really been about convenience anymore. Somewhere between cinnamon tea, quiet conversations, and evenings beside the fireplace, that little cabin had become the safest place I had known in years. Naomi helped carry my suitcase across the snowy path without either of us mentioning how strangely empty the new room felt. At least you will finally have some privacy, she said with a gentle smile. Maybe, I answered, although the word sounded uncertain even to me. We spent most of the afternoon apart. I joined a journaling workshop while Naomi led another watercolor session beside the lake. Every time I caught a glimpse of her across the retreat grounds, she seemed completely present with every woman who approached her. I admired that about her, yet a small part of me suddenly wondered how many other broken hearts had heard the same comforting words she had spoken to me. That evening the retreat hosted its farewell gathering inside the main lodge. Soft music floated through the room while women exchanged phone numbers, hugged one another, and promised to stay connected long after returning home. Naomi remained busy thanking volunteers and organizing supplies for the next retreat. Wanting to surprise her with a small act of kindness, I decided to return the leather portfolio she had accidentally left on a nearby bench outside the lodge. As I picked it up, several papers slipped onto the wooden porch before I could stop them. I immediately knelt to gather them, but one page unfolded in the snow. My eyes caught the heading before I could look away. It was an intake summary from the retreat. My own name appeared across the top. My heartbeat quickened as I read only a few lines describing my recent divorce and emotional withdrawal. Near the bottom, another sentence stopped me completely. Participant assigned to volunteer mentor Naomi Brooks, based on shared life experience and recovery profile. The cold mountain air suddenly felt much sharper. I stared at the page while every conversation we had shared replayed inside my mind. Had our first meeting truly been chance? Or had every comforting moment been part of someone else's plan? Before I could gather another thought, I heard familiar footsteps approaching across the porch. Naomi froze the instant she saw the paper in my hands. The warmth disappeared from her face, replaced by quiet heartbreak. She did not rush toward me or try to take the document away. She simply looked into my eyes and spoke with complete honesty. "Claire," she whispered, "I should have told you much sooner. Please let me explain before you decide that everything between us was only an assignment." For a long moment I could not find my voice. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not because of the cold but because every beautiful memory from the past few days suddenly seemed uncertain. I looked at Naomi, searching her face for anything that resembled deception, yet all I found was quiet regret. "Were you assigned to me from the beginning?" I asked. She nodded once without looking away. "Yes," she answered softly, "but only for the first introduction. Everything that happened after that belonged entirely to us." I wanted to believe her, yet hurt has a way of arriving before understanding. "Then why did you never tell me?" She lowered her eyes for a brief moment before speaking. "Because I was afraid you would stop trusting every conversation we had. I kept waiting for the perfect time, and every day that passed made the truth feel harder to explain." We walked slowly away from the lodge until the voices behind us disappeared beneath the whisper of wind, moving through the evergreen trees. Naomi stopped beside the frozen lake where we had shared so many quiet moments. "When the retreat receives new participants," she said, "volunteer mentors are matched only to make sure nobody feels completely alone during the first day. Most introductions end there. People naturally find their own friendships after that." She looked directly into my eyes, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "The assignment ended long before I realized I was looking forward to every conversation with you. Long before cinnamon tea. Long before the walks. Long before I caught myself hoping you would smile every time I entered a room." I stared across the frozen water, trying to separate what had been arranged from what had been real. "Did you already know everything about my life?" I asked quietly. Naomi immediately shook her head. "Only a short summary. Your age. That your marriage had recently ended. That you felt lost. Nothing else. I learned who Claire Donovan truly was the same way anyone else would have. By listening." Her words settled gently inside me because I knew they were true. She had never finished my sentences. She had never pushed me toward answers. She had simply stayed beside me whenever silence felt safer than speaking. "There is something else," Naomi whispered after a long pause. "Something I have been carrying long before you arrived here." She took a slow breath. 7 years ago, I came to this same retreat as a participant after losing the woman I loved. We spent 24 years together before illness slowly took her from this world. I believed loving anyone again would somehow betray everything we had shared. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she continued with quiet honesty. "Helping other women became the only way I knew how to keep moving forward. Then I met you, and for the first time in years I became frightened again. Not because of grief, but because I realized my heart was waking up. I felt every wall inside me begin to soften. This was not a woman pretending to understand pain. She had lived beside it. I never wanted you to think you were replacing anyone," she said. "No one ever could. She will always be part of my life. But loving once did not prevent my heart from growing again. Meeting you reminded me that healing does not erase the past. It simply teaches us there is still room for tomorrow." I closed my eyes for a moment as the winter breeze brushed gently across my face. Suddenly the document in my hand seemed much smaller than everything we had shared without words. The real question was no longer how we had met. The real question was whether I was brave enough to believe that what we had become was real. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated. It was my daughter calling. When I heard her voice, she paused almost immediately and asked, "Mom, why do you sound happier than you have in years?" My daughter's voice carried a smile before I could answer. "Mom, I do not know what happened during that retreat," she said, "but you sound like yourself again." I looked across the frozen lake toward Naomi, who stood quietly several yards away, giving me the privacy to finish the call. "I think I finally remembered that I am still allowed to have a future," I whispered. My daughter grew silent for a moment before speaking again. "Then promise me something. Anything. Do not walk away from whatever helped you find that feeling." Tears warmed my eyes as I promised her I would not. After we ended the call, I slipped my phone into my coat pocket and remained where I was, letting the mountain air clear the last pieces of fear from my mind. For almost 30 years I had measured every decision by how it would affect someone else. I had been a devoted wife, a loving mother, a dependable friend, and a responsible employee. Somewhere along the way I had forgotten to ask what kind of life Claire wanted. That realization felt both heartbreaking and strangely freeing. Naomi had not moved. She simply waited with the same quiet patience she had shown from the very first day we met. There was no expectation in her eyes. No attempt to persuade me. Only kindness. I slowly walked toward her until we stood only a few feet apart. "I have been thinking about the document," I said softly. "It explained how we met. It did not explain everything that happened afterward." She nodded gently. "Because nothing afterward was written for us." I smiled through tears. "No, it was not." We began walking along the edge of the frozen lake as evening settled over the mountains. The sky glowed with soft shades of lavender and gold, and the first stars quietly appeared above the evergreen trees. I spent so many years believing love meant sacrificing pieces of myself, I admitted. Now I think real love may be the opposite. Naomi looked toward me with gentle curiosity. "What do you think it is?" I took a slow breath before answering. "Being seen exactly as I am, and never feeling like I have to disappear to keep someone else comfortable." Her eyes filled with quiet emotion. "That is the kind of love I have always hoped to give." We stopped near the small wooden bridge where she had caught my hand only days earlier. I remembered the uncertainty I had felt then, and I realized how different that uncertainty had become. It was no longer fear. It was possibility. "You once asked me what I dreamed about before life became busy," I said. "I finally know the answer." Naomi smiled softly. "Tell me." "I dreamed about waking up without pretending. I just never knew it." A gentle breeze moved through the pine trees as I reached for her hand. This time there was no hesitation from either of us. Our fingers naturally found one another, warm against the winter air. She looked at me with quiet disbelief before her smile slowly widened. Neither of us needed dramatic promises because the choice itself was enough. I had already said goodbye to the life that no longer fit my heart. Now, for the first time, I was choosing something instead of simply accepting it. As we stood together watching the last light disappear beyond the mountains, I realized the bravest decision I had ever made was not ending my marriage. It was believing that after all those years, my heart still deserved to begin again. 1 year later, the first snow of winter returned to the Cascade Mountains just as gently as it had the week my life quietly changed forever. I drove the familiar road toward the retreat with the windows slightly open, breathing in the scent of cedar and cold mountain air that no longer reminded me of heartbreak. Instead, it reminded me of beginnings. Naomi was waiting outside the main lodge with 2 steaming mugs of cinnamon tea, smiling before I had even stepped out of the car. Some things had changed during the past year. I had returned to Portland and transformed the smallest room in my house into an art studio filled with watercolor paintings that nobody judged except me. I had started volunteering at the local library again, this time because I loved it instead of because I felt obligated. Emily visited often, and every time she hugged me she whispered the same words. "I have my mother back." Other things had remained beautifully familiar. Naomi still laughed with her whole heart. She still paused to admire every sunrise. She still reached for my hand without making the gesture feel ordinary. Together we had decided not to rush our future or force our story into anyone else's expectations. We simply chose one honest day after another, and somehow those quiet days became a beautiful life. This year we were both volunteering at the retreat, welcoming women who arrived carrying invisible burdens much like the ones we had once carried ourselves. On the first evening, I noticed a woman standing alone near the front entrance with a small suitcase beside her. She looked toward the parking lot more often than toward the lodge, as though she had already decided to leave before giving herself the chance to stay. I recognized that expression immediately because I had worn it myself. She quietly picked up her bag and turned toward the exit path leading back to the road. Without thinking, I walked after her. She stopped when she heard my footsteps but kept her eyes lowered. "I do not belong here," she whispered. "Everyone else probably knows how to heal. I do not." I smiled gently because I remembered believing exactly the same thing. Instead of offering advice, I simply reached out my hand. She looked at it with uncertain eyes. "You do not have to tell anyone your story today," I said softly. "You only have to give yourself one more chance to live it." Her eyes slowly filled with tears as she accepted my hand. Behind us I caught Naomi watching from the lodge porch. She smiled with quiet understanding, and in that single moment I realized our story had come full circle. The kindness she had once offered me had now become something I could offer another woman searching for hope. Later that evening, Naomi and I stood beside the frozen lake where our journey had truly begun. Snow drifted gently across the water while stars quietly filled the winter sky. She slipped her hand into mine, and I smiled without fear, without apology, and without looking back. I had once believed my life ended with a signature on divorce papers. I now understood it had only closed one chapter so another could finally begin. Love had not rescued me from loneliness. It had reminded me that I was never meant to abandon myself in the first place. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding someone who changes your life. Sometimes it is finding someone who quietly helps you remember that your life was always worth living.